In Linux, the permission to execute a script file is based on the permission bits for that file, and each file is individually controlled as to whether or not it is executable. In Windows, the execution of PowerShell scripts is controlled by the machine's execution policies. There is a command to retrieve the existing policies and a command to change them. The policies have a scope, and the scope determines what is affected by the policy. There is a process policy, there is a user policy, a user scope, and a system scope or policy. If you change the policy for a specific PowerShell process, it allows that process to run scripts. If you change it for a given user, they can run scripts as long as they log in as that user, regardless of which process it's in. And if you change it for the entire system, it changes it for all users and all files on the system. So this permission granting can have rather broad implications and should be carefully thought of before being turned on. When we save PowerShell files, we save them with a specific extension of ps1. PS and the digit 1 tells the system that this is a PowerShell script file and should be dealt with as a PowerShell script file. That if execute permission is granted, then the script can be run as a command. If you are in File Manager and double-click a PowerShell script, the default action is to open that script in an editing window, like Notepad. That's so that you don't accidentally run scripts, since the execution policy has such broad applicability to the users in the system. If a file does not have a ps1 extension, Windows will not treat it as a PowerShell script file, even if it contains PowerShell commands. The execution policy on the system can be retrieved using the get execution policy command. When we run get execution policy, it will show you the current policy that applies to the PowerShell that ran the command. In my case, it says restricted, which means no scripts may be run. That doesn't tell me whether this is a user policy, or a system policy, or a process policy. That is simply the policy that applies to scripts that I try to run from this command window. There are several available policies. You can change your current policy using the set execution policy command and giving it as a parameter a policy name. This can only be done by the system administrator, so you'll have to use the Run as Administrator option when starting PowerShell, or you will be unable to change the execution policy. The policy choices are restricted, which is the default in most versions of Windows, and restricted means no scripts may be run on this machine for PowerShell, no matter how you try to run them. All signed is the next choice, which means any script which has an author's signature embedded in it is possible to run. If you try to run one, it will compare the signature to previously authorized signatures, and if it is a previously authorized signature, the script will simply run. If it is not previously authorized, you will get a pop-up saying who the script was signed by and asking if you allow scripts to be run that are signed by that user. If you select the Yes checkbox and run it, then that will save it as a previously authorized author for the next time you try to run a script from them. The next choice is Remote Sign, which means if a script has an indicator in it that it was downloaded from the internet, then it must be signed in order to run. If it does not have the indicator for remote download, then it does not require a signature and will simply run. The next choice is unrestricted, which means whether or not a script has a signature, it can be run. And the last choice is bypass, which means none of these rules apply and execution policy is simply ignored on this machine. Restricted is the default on most versions of Windows up to PowerShell 5.1 and Windows Server 2012 R2. After Windows Server 2012 R2, Microsoft changed the default policy to remote signed. The newest versions of Windows will have remote signed as their default. If you're changing from restricted on your machine to a policy to permit scripts to run, the official recommended policy from Microsoft is remote signed. For more information on these policies, how to retrieve them and set them, and what the different choices mean, there is a help document called About Execution Policies that you can refer to. The execution policies are specific to Windows. They do not exist in the PowerShell core because PowerShell core is cross-platform and all of this policy stuff is Windows specific. There is an option to get execution policy that you should know, the -list option or -list parameter. The nice thing about -list is, instead of just showing the policy applicable to this command process, -list will tell you what all the settings are that apply. The machine policy, the user policy, the process policy, whether or not there's something specific to the current user or the local machine. When a policy is undefined, it has the same effect as being restricted. The most specifically matching policy is the one that will apply to you. Try to create a file called helloworld.ps1. Inside that file, put a single line, hello world, in quotes, and try to run it as a command. If your policy is restricted, that command should fail to run. Then try setting your execution policy to a mode like remote signed to allow those scripts to run, and rerun that command. Let's go ahead and create that here. I'm going to be creating scripts. ISE is a good tool for creating scripts because it allows us to have text editing windows. If I go ahead and create a file called Hello World, and I were to save this, in my GitHub Documents folder, this would be a good time to make my PowerShell folder inside my repository or local copy of my repository, and create my file in here called helloworld.ps1. If I were to change directory to Documents, GitHub, Comp 2101, PowerShell, and take a look at my list of available files, I should now see helloworld.ps1. And if I were to put in the name of that file as a command, helloworld.ps1, I'm going to get an error that says running scripts is disabled, and a reference about the About Execution Policies help document telling me how to solve my problem. If I go ahead and get an administrator window using Run as Administrator and do set execution policy to a policy that allows me to run scripts, and go back to my ISE window and try again to run my command, I should now find that it runs and prints out "Hello World." When you set the execution policy like this, it saves it for reboot. So even if I reboot Windows, that policy will stay in effect. The only way to change it again is to rerun the set execution policy command and change it to something else. The next video will discuss command paths and getting PowerShell to find your script commands.